Hello and welcome back. You're tuned into TMH Daily English News. The headlines for today: Ethiopian National Defense Force members have admitted committing widespread atrocities within the Tigray region. Ambush on militia in Ethiopia's Oromia region has killed 26 civilians. And Georgia State Senate Assembly calls for the end to weaponized starvation within the Tigray region. As we move on to the main stories for today, Ethiopian National Defense Force members have admitted having committed widespread atrocities in the Tigray region. A new leaked video of meeting between Ethiopian soldiers and their commanders revealed rampant killings, rape, and looting of civilians within the Tigray region. Let's take a listen.
We are labeling all Tigrinya speakers as junta. This misguided thinking is claiming the lives of civilians, including children. For instance, the other soldiers killed a child of 5 or 6 years old and buried his body up to his neck. We're committing such a misconduct.
The
other misconduct is rape. In our division, it started with 2 cases of rape, but no lesson was learned and the misconduct continued. And now there are a number of cases. Civilian casualties are on increase along with destruction of property. Looting of civilians is going on. The case of one member of our unit who forcefully took money from one elderly person is an example. The soldier admitted 6,000 birr, though the victim claims he was robbed 8,000 birr. Looting? I would rather call it robbery. We can't control it. We are mandated to safeguard citizens. That's what this uniform is all about. Instead, we're using force to rob them. Up to now, our army is busy plundering the civilian population. Just recently, they beat one young man and took 200 birr by force. There are also soldiers who loot teff and wheat.
The soldiers also disclosed how Eritrean invading troops mistreated Ethiopian soldiers as well. Some of them, Ethiopian army commanders, expressed dismay at the directive given to them by the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's office not to stand in the way of Eritrean troops who were busy transporting looted property from Tigray back to Eritrea. In related news, the World Health Organization chief accused Ethiopian and Eritrean troops of still imposing a blockade on the Tigray region. WHO Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom said in the siege of 6 million people in Tigray by Eritrean and Ethiopian forces for over 500 days is one of the longest in modern history. He said the current situation in Tigray still remains catastrophic, and despite the government's declaration of a humanitarian truce. Dr. Tedros said no food has reached Tigray since mid-December, and almost no fuel has been delivered since August of last year. Every hour makes a difference when people are starving to death, he added. The complaints come days after Bloomberg reported sighting Ethiopian troops moving to Kobo town in the Amhara region, where regional troops have been accused of blocking humanitarian trucks and heading to the Tigray region. Congresswoman Ilham Omar last week sought answers over the situation in Tigray, arguing that the world needs to know whether or not Ethiopia is respecting the so-called humanitarian truce. African arguments expose the Ethiopian government's pattern of resetting the humanitarian clock. African Arguments published an article titled Ethiopia's Humanitarian Truce and Its Cycle of Empty Promises. This article explains why many observers remain skeptical about Abiy Ahmed's government's latest promise of a free-flow humanitarian aid into Tigray. And according to the African arguments, the news of the humanitarian truce was largely welcomed with significant enthusiasm by the UN, the US, and several European countries. It added that many others, however, remain skeptical for numerous reasons, And African arguments attributed the skepticism to the notable lack of clarity and action since the declaration, the federal government's record of using deceptive tactics since the war began in November of 2020. The fact that Addis Ababa is responsible for the humanitarian crisis in Tigray in the first place as well. The article further noted that even before the onset of conflict, the federal government blocked roads leading to Tigray and suspended the annual budget legally allocated to the region. When the war started, Ethiopian and allied Eritrean forces systematically decimated the region, agriculture, and infrastructure under the cover of a media blockout. The federal government blocked essential services, including banking, telecommunication, electricity. Most attempts by international agencies to deliver aid were and continue to be with bureaucratic constraints, attacks on drivers and convoys, delays, or just simple refusal as well. The article indicated that the Ethiopian government's unexpected announcement of a humanitarian truce seems to be in line with its vociferous efforts to forestall the legislative measures that have been building in the U.S. Congress for months now. And according to African arguments, this mirrors a pattern seen repeatedly during the war of resetting the humanitarian clock by appearing to comply with international demands, while in reality, little changes have happened. African arguments noted that the people of Tigray cannot afford to go through another cycle of empty promises in the international inaction and worsening current crises. Devon MP calls on the investigation into sexual violence used in world conflicts. A conservative member of the parliament from Devon says a new independent international body is needed now to investigate sexual violence in conflict. Asking an urgent question on Ukraine with particular reference to the use of rape as a weapon of war, Anthony Mangnall said it is a tragic reality that in conflicts and crises around the world, rape and sexual violence have become a weapon of war. He added sexual violence are tools of the vicious and violent, and the consequences have a long and far-reaching impact on the individuals, their families, as well as their communities. He said, and it is happening in Tigray, it's happening in Myanmar, it's happening in Iraq, and now it's happening in Ukraine. Since the start of the conflict, there have been widespread reports of Russian troops reporting to rape and sexual violence against women and their girls as well. The MP, who's a chairman of all-party parliamentary group on preventing sexual violence and conflict initiative, stressed that steps need to be taken now in relation to Ukraine. He said it can minister report that all crimes and sexual violence will be documented and persecuted where this will take place. He reiterated his call for a new independent international body to investigate sexual violences and conflict where it takes place, a body that will support survivors, document crimes, and prosecute the perpetrators, working with local courts. Another MP, Dottie, also called for a special tribunal and prosecute all the crimes, including the crime of aggression. A Foreign Office minister said the UK government is currently working with international partners to strengthen the response to taking sexual violence and conflict, and all options are on the table. Responding to Magnall's question on what the government is doing to document crimes of sexual violence, she said the Metropolitan recently operationalized their war crimes division that is helping to collect evidence from those who have come to the UK, and that will support the ICC as well. Gunmen have been suspected to be from Ethiopias Amhara Regional killed 26 people and injured 15 in an ambush on a vehicle carrying militia in neighboring Oromia. Ababu Wako, head of the East Shawa district, said Tuesday's raid targeted a vehicle carrying about 100 militia members as it passed through the town of Korke in Oromia, about 170 kilometers southeast of the capital of Addis Ababa. Local administrator Fraser Awara said the assailants came in 7 vehicles from a nearby town in the Amhara region. We are still burying those who died, he said. Ababu said the 2 federal policemen and 1 driver were among the dead after the attack. He also said the assailants called Oromia militia members with a phone call from one of the deceased to say that they were members of the Fano volunteer Amhara militia. Reuters reported that Fano does not have a formal leadership structure, so it was impossible to seek comment. A spokesman for the Amhara Regional government did not respond to any requests for comment. Georgia State Assembly has called for an end to weaponized starvation within the Tigray region. In a press conference called to highlight the Senate resolution of SR 800 addressing the humanitarian crisis in Tigray, Ethiopia, members of Georgia Senate Assembly said they will stand in solidarity with the people of Tigray who are currently suffering in silence under the weaponized starvation. On the occasion, Senator Jackson said Tigray should not suffer in silence anymore.
Today, we as members of the General Assembly are calling for the immediate restoration of electricity, of telephones and internet service, which will be needed to facilitate the restoration of their healthcare system. Today, we are calling for the unfettered humanitarian access to the millions of people in the Tigray region of Ethiopia who are facing weaponized starvation. And we today are calling for the support for vulnerable populations, including refugees, internally displaced persons, victims of gender-based violence, and those who are displaced by this genocidal war in Ethiopia. Today, we as members of the General Assembly are calling for the immediate restoration of electricity, of telephones and internet service, which will be needed to facilitate the restoration of their healthcare system. Today, we are calling.
Nearly 1,000 people per day died in Tigray within the last 500+ days due to man-made famine, war, and health deprivation, a situation she called, quote-unquote, unfathomable. She reiterated the Senate Assembly's call for an immediate, unfettered humanitarian aid to the Tigray region.
Thus, as members of the Georgia Senate, we are calling for immediate, unfettered humanitarian access across Tigray to allow for the delivery of life-saving food aid, medicine, and the full restoration of telecommunications, power, and banking services. We are in full support of the UN's ongoing human rights investigations in the region. We stand today with our Tigrayan constituents here in Georgia and their families.
Tigray is directly impacted by the ongoing genocide in Tigray, also highlighted in the plight of people of the Tigray region.
I cannot adequately describe the crippling horror of wondering every moment of my day whether my family members have food and if they have starved to death. It is beyond cruel to cut an entire population of people off from the world in the midst of their darkest hours, leaving them unable to advocate for themselves and share the horrors that they face.
Other prominent members of the Senate members of Atlanta Jewish community, Tigrayan community in Atlanta were also present on this occasion. The last update for today, the Ethiopian regime's attempt to block funding to probe atrocities committed in Tigray and the northern Ethiopia as whole has failed. The Ethiopian government's effort at the UN General Assembly's 5th committee to deny funding for the UN Commission of Human Rights experts was rejected by a majority of votes of 66 total. Ethiopia failed at the United Nations on Thursday in a bid to block funding for an independent investigation into the abuses in the country's conflict, garnering just 27 yes votes, while 66 countries opposed the move and 39 countries completely abstained. That concludes our news for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.